Well, yeah, thanks again for the wonderful introduction and for the invite to speak with you all today. I'm really excited to share some of that work. So the work from the meta-analysis that we all did over many years, and to show how conservation action is really important for restoring species resilience. Okay, but in Australia, we like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where we live and work. And so during the timeline of this project, I worked on Whadjuk Noongar country and Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I wanted to pay my respects to elders past and present. So acknowledging country honours First Nations people's enduring connection to land. And I think as we're confronted with this biodiversity crisis, we have so much to learn from Indigenous stewardship and Indigenous people's long history of caring for country. But straight to the point, I wanted to again share. I wanted to share the results of this global meta-analysis that many of the people that I've seen on this call were involved with, and it was a huge team effort. And we wanted to look at patterns of genetic diversity loss, and just as importantly, what conservation action can actually tell us about addressing this loss. And so this was a huge project, and as I said before, it wouldn't have happened without the sustained energy and generosity of more than 50 collaborators that are listed on this slide across 5 years. The project was initiated through the IUCN Conservation Genetics Specialist Group, and many of us met at an initial workshop that was sponsored by GBike. And from there, the project just kept growing. So the co-leads, which included myself, Catherine Gruber and Kate Farquharson, the core team, who are underlined here in green, and also dozens of other collaborators stayed really engaged and energized throughout the entire project. So I guess I just wanted to start by saying that this collaboration was really the heart of the project and the thing I'm most proud of, and has really shown me what we can achieve when we all work together towards a shared goal, which I'm sure all of you as part of the ERGA network can definitely resonate with all of you as well. So I guess we were kind of jumping to the end there, but what was the reason we all came together for this big collaboration? Well, we were all worried about genetic diversity and that it wasn't being captured in conservation policy and practice. So within species, genetic diversity is critical, as everyone on this call will know. It provides the adaptive capacity and resilience that allows populations to persist through environmental change. And in the context of the current biodiversity crisis, that matters more than ever. So according to IPBES, biodiversity is declining faster now than at any other point in human history. And the 5 big direct drivers of that decline are well known, and they're listed here on this slide. But most of the research looking at these drivers of loss tend to focus on species level diversity. So we wanted to know whether these threats are also impacting genetic diversity. So really, we wanted to know, what is the global status of genetic diversity? We had a few key questions we wanted to ask. So what are the general patterns of genetic change across different study designs and contexts that are out there? Are losses greater when populations are exposed to threats? And most importantly, is there any evidence that conservation actions can actually slow, halt, or reverse these losses? And we focused on what we called human impacted timeframes. So that means within the last 500 years, although in some cases it might have extended beyond that if the study clearly linked human activity to population history. So before we looked at the data, we had some clear ideas about how we expected genetic diversity might respond to disturbance in conservation. So at one end of the spectrum, we might expect to have sort of a stable population, one that's large and connected. And in this case, we would expect genetic diversity to be maintained over time. But in some cases, a population might go through an ecological disturbance, and this might result in a massive population decline or bottleneck. And in this case, we might see a loss of genetic diversity. And so to test this, we classified different types of disturbances across all the studies, and we came up with 10 different types of disturbance. And this allowed us to ask the question, are some types of disturbance more likely to be associated with genetic diversity loss than others? Next, if there was a conservation intervention, a few different outcomes could be possible. So first, it might not be effective, meaning that we continue to see this decline in genetic diversity. And this might lead to an extinction vortex where things like inbreeding and drift start to accelerate the loss. Secondly, we might see a moderated loss where genetic diversity still declines, but more slowly than it would have without a conservation intervention. And that tells us that conservation helped, but it didn't fully stop the loss. Third, we might halt the loss entirely. And so that means genetic diversity might level off and be maintained at this lower level. And then finally, the best case scenario is that conservation might actually reverse the loss. And in this case, genetic diversity might increase, either returning to pre-disturbance levels, or in some cases, it might exceed them. So that sort of led us to these three different options. Conservation might work, it might slow or halt genetic diversity loss, or it might improve or maintain genetic diversity over time. And so our aims were to see if these general patterns were supported by the global data. That being said, it's important to acknowledge that our study was correlational. So we're looking at associations rather than direct causation. But even so, these patterns still help us to learn a lot about where conservation might be making a difference. So to do this, we started with a really broad literature search in the Web of Science, targeting any study that reported temporal data on genetic diversity. So that gave us over 80,000 hits. And then using text mining, we narrowed this down to around 34,000 studies that actually included relevant genetic diversity metrics. From there, the real work began, as I'm sure many on the call can attest to. The team manually screened studies and extracted data through in-person workshops, online drop-in sessions, and then shared systems of protocols and templates and sign-up sheets. Each study was assessed in detail, and that often required pretty in-depth discussions and judgment calls, especially to interpret whether threats or conservation actions actually occurred between the sampling time points. That information was rarely stated clearly, so we often really had to dig into the paper and the supplementary materials. It took months of collaborative screening and then years of follow-up validation. And one of the biggest challenges was making all of these different studies with different markers, metrics, and designs comparable. And so to do this, we used a meta-analysis where we converted each result into a standardized effect size called Hedges G. And that captures change in genetic diversity between the two time points. But to calculate this properly, we need sample sizes and error estimates, and many papers don't report these. So some studies had to be excluded just because they didn't have this data. And this is one of our key recommendations. If we want genetic data to be reusable, we really need to report these error metrics and sample sizes. So we need better reporting standards. And this is because this type of data can be used in a weighted meta-analysis where we use more precise studies to contribute more to the overall pattern. So we used a Bayesian hierarchical model to account for the variation across species, timeframes, and study designs, and then to detect these broad patterns in how genetic diversity is changing over time. So after all that work, what did we come up with? I'm going to blaze through some of these results because there are a lot summarizing all of these studies, but I'd encourage you to go have a look at the paper if you're interested in digging in more detail. Our final data set included 4,000 estimates from nearly 900 studies spanning 3 decades and 141 countries. Like most biodiversity data, it wasn't evenly spread. Most of the studies came from developed economies, especially North America and Western Europe, with fewer from tropical areas in the global south, even though these regions obviously are biodiversity hotspots. So this is a key gap when we're measuring genetic diversity change globally. Most of the data came from studies using microsatellites, and there were very few whole genome studies, which might interest you in ERGA, but we only incorporated studies up to early 2019, so that might kind of explain why. Timeframes were usually short and often just spanned a few generations. We also looked across the entire tree of life, or the multicellular tree of life. Our dataset included species from all the major groups: animals, plants, fungi, and chromis. Most of the animal data came from vertebrates like birds and mammals and fish, which again reflects the research bias. So this tells us about how genetic diversity is measured, but was there an overall change in genetic diversity over time detected across these decades of research? Well, across the entire data set, there was a statistically significant decline in genetic diversity over time. So we are seeing genetic diversity loss globally. The average effect size was small, but even small changes in genetic diversity can reflect major demographic shifts. So this means that genetic diversity is declining across the bulk of the data after accounting for random effects and generation length. To make sense of all this variation, we then ran meta-regressions across the different study designs, including different study durations, marker types, diversity metrics. And what's really striking is that the patterns varied in their magnitude of loss, but the overall pattern of loss was still apparent no matter how we sliced up the data. So across these different timescale study designs, genetic markers and metrics, we saw this loss. And that's really important because it shows that we can detect change using a variety of methods, even older, more traditional ones like microsatellites. That means we already have the tools for tracking genetic change, we just need to implement them. We also found consistent loss across red list threat statuses, meaning that even species that aren't currently listed as threatened were still showing genetic diversity loss. This aligns with other studies. However, we did find that there was some variation across biogeographic realms and taxonomic groups. So in particular, birds and mammals showed the greatest loss, but they're also the most heavily studied. So that might be influencing the results slightly. Importantly, though, just because we don't detect a significant loss in some groups doesn't mean that those populations are safe. No loss doesn't mean no risk. There could be a time lag, and especially in species with long generation times. We also found that genetic diversity loss was most commonly associated with some of the ecological disturbances like abiotic natural events, including wildfires or floods, disease outbreaks, harvesting or harassment of populations, and especially land use change like habitat clearing and fragmentation. These are all threats that we know drive population and ecosystem level declines, and now we have evidence that they're also impacting within species genetic diversity. But it's not all doom and gloom. So we found some reasons for hope. Supplementation, so that's things like restoring natural connectivity and gene flow, translocations for genetic rescue and population reintroduction. This was the only action where we saw genetic diversity actually increase. And that's huge because it shows that well-targeted interventions can not only stop loss, but actually restore adaptive potential. A second group of actions, like ecological restoration, invasive species control, and population control, didn't increase diversity, but genetic diversity was maintained over time, suggesting that they might moderate the effect of loss compared to populations with no intervention, although this wasn't significant. Interestingly, legal protection alone, so that's things like protecting habitat or legally listing a species, it wasn't enough to stop genetic diversity loss. So that suggests that passive protection might be too slow or too weak to actually prevent genetic diversity loss, especially if the underlying threats still remain. And so what we found out was that genetic diversity is declining globally, especially in birds and mammals. Loss is occurring even in populations that aren't classified as threatened, but some conservation actions can work, especially supplementation. So the window to act is open, but we need to do it now. So how can we do this? Well, first of all, we can monitor genetic diversity alongside threats and conservation action to inform strategic management. If we don't have temporal data already, we can start now because these single snapshots are really important for tailoring our management action. If we can't do that, we can leverage these older data sets from museums and from other studies like in our database, because these older methods are still sensitive and still tell us something really important. And they can also act as that kind of foundation or that baseline to tell us about change. And then finally, if there's no genetic data, we can still use proxies. So other ecological data can actually be used to help us embed genetic thinking into biodiversity risk assessment. So that's things like maintaining large population sizes and connectivity. So thank you very much again for the opportunity to present with you all, and happy to take questions if there's time.